How you doing, guys? It's your boy, and I got a special treat for all of you today, because we're going to start a new video series where I go over a lot of my favorite bands and artists that I've listened to over the years and grew up with, and we're going to rank their discography using Tier Maker. That's right, we're going to be making tier lists, baby. Okay, maybe it won't always be me making the tier list per se, but if there are some artists, musicians, anything like that, that don't already have a tier list, then I'll make one. Otherwise, if I could just find one on Tier Maker, that's what we're gonna do. And for the first installment of this series, that's what I did. I'm sure you guys might know by now that I like practically anything that catches my ear. It could be pop music, it could be rock music, hip hop, anything in between. You probably noticed Ariana Grande stuff behind me, so, you know, that's a bit of a given. However, through and through, I'll always be a metalhead. And I figure the perfect way to start off this series is with the very granddaddies of heavy metal, and that's the one and only Black Sabbath. I mean, what more can be said about Black Sabbath that hasn't already been said already, you know? They invented heavy metal, they invented stoner rock, they invented doom metal. They've just been a true driving force of extreme music, you know? It's no wonder that music has forever changed ever since they came out. Now, all that being said, it hasn't been smooth sailing for this band by any means. I mean, when they first came out, critics absolutely hated this band. So it took a while for people to really appreciate what they were bringing to the table for music. And they went through like half a dozen different vocalists, and with each change up of vocalists and other band members comes like a different style, a different direction for their sound. So that very signature sound that we know them for, from like Paranoid, Master of Reality, their debut, that hasn't been the case throughout their career. And they've definitely had a lot of highs and lows. So I figure with this tier list, we're just going to go over every single studio album that they've recorded, go through all the different phases and eras that they've been through throughout their career, and we'll just see how well everything holds up. So, if you want to see all that and more, be sure to stick around! Alright guys, so I happened to find this template on Tier Maker. It's got every single studio album that they've released over the years, and as you can see, everything's in chronological order, starting with their self-titled debut, Paranoid, Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage, Technical Ecstasy, Never Say Die, Heaven and Hell, Mob Rules, Born Again, Seven Star, The Eternal Idol, Headless Cross, Tear, Dehumanizer, Cross Purposes, Forbidden, and 13. This one right here, this is just a remaster of Heaven and Hell, so we're just going to skip this one. But other than that, we go to all the albums right here. And as you can see, we got the different tiers. F tier just means the album's absolutely terrible. D tier, it's pretty bad. C, it's kind of like, it's meh, you know, sort of average. B, pretty darn good. A, excellent. S tier, absolute classic. So, let's start off with the first album, which is Black Sabbath. This came out early 1970. And this album has forever changed music. This pretty much invented doom metal, this invented heavy metal. And it's got some bangers on it, man. That title track at the very beginning of the album is so good, very iconic song. If I had to pick like top 5 Sabbath songs, I would easily put it in there for sure. The Wizard's pretty darn good. Behind the Wall of Sleep, NIB is another classic from them. I really love that bass line on NIB. And overall, the performances are really good. The guitars from Tony Iommi, and just that crazy thumping bass from Geezer Butler. I love his tones, man. And on NIB, he's got a really cool bass line on there. It's very distorted. It's like wow, 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 wow. Oh yeah! It just sounds great. That being said, it's a little rough around the edges, and you know, they didn't quite have their signature style yet. You see a lot of the groundwork, but it's not exactly like, oh yes, this is definitive Black Sabbath and only definitive Black Sabbath. No, it took a little bit, because you figure they were still being compared to a lot of other psychedelic rock, hard rock at the time, so that definitely seeps through with the sound, which is not bad or anything. It's more like it took a little bit for them to fully establish their identity, you know? And I have to say too, Ozzy Osbourne is, his performance is a little rough, let's just say. Sometimes he sounds like he got a bit of a lisp, you know, like a drunken lisp, if you guys know what I'm talking about. And, you know, he tries singing on Warning and Sleeping Village, and, you know, it's not the best, let's just say. But the album's pretty stylish, it's historically significant, it's got some banger songs on it. So for me, it gets at least an A tier. Next up, we got Paranoid, and Paranoid is often heralded as one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. A lot of people agree on this being Black Sabbath's finest hour, their magnum opus, just their absolute best album. It's not hard to see why. It's absolutely stacked. You got War Pigs, Paranoid, Iron Man,
Has he lost his mind? Can he see or is he blind?
Fairies Wear Boots, Electric Funeral. This album they sound a lot more confident in their sound. Pretty much everything we know and love about them started here. The production's better, Ozzy's performance is better. Overall, the album it's punchier, it's heavier, and it's so good, man. It's such an incredible album. Like, this is hands down, like, one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. It even has a serious argument as the greatest heavy metal album of all time. Definitely one of my favorites, hands down, and this is easily going up in S tier. Next up, we got Master of Reality. This is often cited as having invented stoner rock, especially with the song Sweet Leaf.
I love you, sweetly. Oh, you get me oh, yeah.
And Tony Iommi, the guitarist, he had some kind of accident leading up to the recording of this album, where like a couple of his fingers, like the tips of his fingers, got snipped off. So it was more difficult for him to like press down on the guitar strings. But as a result, what he decided to do was tune down his guitars. And that also inspired Geezer Butler to tune down his guitar too. And that just created like this overall thicker, heavier guitar tone. And that's actually been extremely influential for sure. A lot of bands that want to go for that heavier, punchier guitar sound with their metal music, their hard rock, they often cite this album as an influence. And stylistically, it's a little bit different from Paranoid. It's definitely groovier for sure. And there's quite a few instrumentals, even though they're more like transitional instrumentals. So, you know, it takes more creative liberties. Pretty much the first 3 albums or so, they all have like their own creative liberties, but this one just further continued that. I don't think it's quite as good as Paranoid, but it is a very good album nonetheless. And it's pretty stacked in its own right. You know, Sweet Leaf is very good. Children of the Grave is a classic.
Children of today are children of the grave, yeah.
Into the Void, I love that song. That's one of my favorite Black Sabbath songs. Hands down, for sure. So for me, I don't know if it's as good as their debut. I'm not too sure about that one. So for right now, I'm going to put it next to it in A tier. Next up, we got Volume 4, and this marks their 4th album in under 3 years. I mean, that's crazy, man. I don't know how they did that. But by the time that this album came out, it definitely started to show that Tony Iommi, being the only real creative force behind the music, was definitely starting to wear thin on the band. And it definitely comes through in the sound. It just doesn't sound as inspired. It doesn't take as many creative liberties as the previous albums did. The production also feels quite rushed. To me, the drums are too loud, and that's coming from a drummer. To me, the drums are too loud, the guitar sounds a little thin. And, you know, I don't know what it is. I never really cared for this album too much. It's got some decent songs. I like Wheel of Confusion. And Supernaut's a great song as well. I even think the song Changes is pretty underrated.
I'm going through changes.
And that's one of Ozzy's first true showcases of actually singing, not just like doing his usual thing where he's singing to the guitar, you know, like to the rhythm, but actually commanding vocals, you know. So that's a bit of a bright spot with this album. So it's got some decent songs. It's not too bad overall. But to me, this is by far the weakest of their first 6 albums. So I'm gonna put it down in B tier. Next up, we got Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and this is definitely an improvement above Volume 4 for sure. That title track is absolutely incredible. I love that riff, like do 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 do.
Sabbath, bloody Sabbath, nothing more to do. Living just for dying, dying just for you. Yeah.
That riff is absolutely amazing. And really, in general, this whole album, it's heavier. It's got some more progressive elements to it compared to the previous albums that they've recorded. It's just really good. National Acrobat, another great song for this one too. This definitely gets it gets a pretty solid A tier from me. I would probably put it behind Master of Reality. I don't know if it's quite as good as that album. I just think Master of Reality is a bit more stacked, but still, very good album nonetheless. Next up, we got Sabotage, and oh man, I love this album. This album's awesome, dude. This the funny thing is, I probably had this album maybe on the same level as Volume 4, where the only song I truly loved was Symptom of the Universe, and thought everything else was like, it was okay.
Symptom of the universe and love that never dies.
But that was a while ago, and ever since I revisited it, I'm like, holy crap, this album freaking rocks, man. It's so good. Hole in the Sky.
Hole in the sky, gateway to heaven.
Megalomania, The Ritz, Thrill of It All. Those songs are stacked, man. Now, I don't think it's quite S tier, because, I mean, Paranoid is just so good. But I'm actually going to put it as their second best on the tier list, at A+. So as you can see, the original 6 albums from Black Sabbath, they're all pretty darn good in their own right, ranging from good, to great, to absolutely classic. But then we got Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. These were the last 2 Ozzy albums before he came back, like, what, 34, 35 years later, something like that, with 13. And yeah, it's a pretty long gap. Figure, all these albums right here, Ozzy was not a part of it whatsoever. That's just insane. And unfortunately, we have to end his reign with a whimper. These albums are just not very good in my opinion. Technical Ecstasy, Never Say Die, I feel like they were just going through the motions, and, you know, just the overall creative inspiration, that spark to their music was just long gone by now. And there's no real hard-hitting songs. Really, the only one that I like truly like, is Never Say Die's title track.
Never, never, never say die.
I think for that reason, I'd even put it slightly above Technical Ecstasy. But for me, these represent the first C-tier albums from Black Sabbath. Have no fear, guys, because even though Ozzy's era ended on a bit of a whimper with these 2 albums right here, they come roaring back 2 years later with the one and only Heaven and Hell. And that's because Ronnie James Dio makes his first entrance with the band. And he even takes over the lyrics. That way Tony Iommi can focus more on his guitar, the arrangements, and then you got the usual bass and drum shenanigans with Geezer Butler and Bill Ward. You know, just a very tight rhythm section. Tony doing his usual thing. And this is actually the first album where he really just lets loose with his guitar solos. Probably some of the best guitar solos I've ever heard in his entire career, hands down. This album, Heaven and Hell, man, this album is just so good. It is so stacked. You got Neon Nights. Heaven and Hell. Wishing Well, Lonely is the Word, Children of the Sea. Man, this album is all thriller, no filler, just like Paranoid. I wouldn't say it's quite as good as Paranoid, but to me, Heaven and Hell, I fell in love with it when I first heard it, and I still believe, definitively, it is not only the best non-Ozzy Black Sabbath album, I think it's just straight up their second best album they've ever done. And for that reason, it's going to go in S tier. Next up on the list, we've got Mob Rules. This is the second album that they did with Dio, and it's really more or less a continuation of Heaven and Hell in my opinion. It definitely sounds a lot like Heaven and Hell, with a little bit of differences. The drums sound a little different. I think the vocals are maybe just a touch quieter, and Dio definitely had a field day with Tony Iommi about that. And that actually led to his departure, because the next album, Dio's nowhere to be found. But anyway, I don't think this album is quite as good as Heaven and Hell, and they had to swap out Bill Ward for a different drummer, and his drumming's not quite as good either. But this album's still really good. Voodoo, the Sign of the Southern Cross,
It's the sign of the Southern Cross.
the title track, Country Girl, these are all just very stacked songs, very good indeed. And to me, it definitely gets probably a low A tier. I think I would put it, I'd say right about there. I'd give it a low A tier. It is very good, very underrated, for sure. So even though it's not quite as good as Heaven and Hell, and it's really more of the same, I'm not complaining because of how much I love Heaven and Hell. So this album definitely gets A tier for sure. Now we're entering the mid-1980s, and this is pretty much the no man's land era for Black Sabbath. You figure Ozzy's long gone by now, Dio just recently left the band, and now it's up to Ian Gillan from Deep Purple to step up to the plate with Born Again. And I don't think he quite delivered. His voice is a little worse for wear, I think. He definitely sounded better with Deep Purple about a decade prior. So I wasn't very impressed with this album on the whole. Even Tony's playing just seems kind of complacent, and really in general, the production's a little rough around the edges too. There's no real song that stands out to me too much. So as a result, I'm going to put this in low C tier. It's probably their worst album so far. That being said, the next album, 7 Star, which features Glenn Hughes on vocals, he also was a vocalist in Deep Purple. Now this album is definitely a step above Born Again. It's got some pretty darn good songs. You know, it's got the title track, it's got Stranger for Love. It's a really, really cheesy album. It has to be said.
Living on the streets, I'm no stranger to the world. Why can't you see I'm no stranger to love?
But overall, I actually kind of like it. I think it's pretty good. And for that reason, I'll put it in low B tier. So now by this stage of the game, we're entering the late 1980s, and we got a new vocalist who would actually remain on 5 of Black Sabbath's albums. That would make him the second longest running vocalist for the band altogether, behind Ozzy Osbourne. And we're talking about Tony Martin, and he makes his debut with the Eternal Idol. Well, fun fact for you, Ray Gillan, he was actually the first vocalist to record with the Eternal Idol. They actually recorded the entire album with him. And if we're going to go by that version, I would put it in low A tier. I really like the version with Ray Gillan. The production is a little more raw, but it's also more punchy. And I just really appreciate his dynamic, just incredible range with his voice. Definitely suits him very well. Tony Martin, though, I'm not as impressed with his performance, but I still think the album's pretty darn good. You figure you got The Shining, Ancient Warrior, Hard Life to Love. The title track is really, really good. Probably the best song on the album for sure. It's actually a pretty stacked album, I have to say. And actually, for that reason, even with Tony, because he does sound pretty good, I would actually give this a high B tier. So I would actually put this above Volume 4. And I know, get ready to get your pitchforks, get ready to get your torches, your stones, and come to my house and just throw rocks at me, light my house on fire for this spicy take, let's just say. But yeah, Eternal Idol's pretty good, man. Tony, and especially with Ray Gillen. So I would definitely recommend the Ray Gillen version, and I'll actually put a link in the description box down below so you guys can check that one out for yourself. The 1990s are almost here as we make our way towards Headless Cross, and this is actually the first of the Tony Martin era albums where Tony Martin actually has any significant songwriting credits. That's because with The Eternal Idol, they wrote the album before he came with the band because they had Ray Gillen beforehand. But pretty much he sings his own way on this album rather than just trying to duplicate what Ray Gillen did with The Eternal Idol. But I don't know, I think his performance is a little too exaggerated for my taste. I think he's trying too hard to sound like Dio, but just more melodic and more dynamic, I guess. And I don't know, I never really liked that too much. I think the album's okay. It's got some decent songs. I like Nightwing, that's a pretty good song. And the When Death Calls, Killing the Spirit World, those songs are pretty decent too. But I don't know, I would probably give it maybe a low B tier, C+. It's probably my least favorite Tony Martin album, with one big exception, which we'll get to later on. I'm gonna probably give it a low B tier. I think that's fair. The 1990s are here, and Black Sabbath is starting it off with Tear. Rhyme intended, of course. And Tear, in my opinion, is definitely a step above Headless Cross for sure. Now, a lot of the people that like Tony Martin probably put Headless Cross as their favorite. I'm not one of them. It's my least favorite, with one exception. Again, we'll get to that later on. But Tear, in my opinion, is just a better version of this album for sure. I like Tony's vocals more. He doesn't sound like a Dio tryhard like what he's doing on Headless Cross. I know, blasphemy, right? But I think his overall performance, it feels more soulful, it feels more authentic to me, and the production's better, and really just the songs are pretty stacked, not gonna lie. You know, Anno Mundi is very good, The Lawmaker, Jerusalem, Valhalla, just really good songs. I definitely like this one a lot. It's arguably my favorite Tony Martin song, or not song, it's arguably my favorite album with Tony Martin. It's either that or Eternal Idol. I'm not really sure which one I like better. I think the Eternal Idol might be a little more stacked, plus I really like the Ray Gillen version, so I'm gonna put it just below the Eternal Idol, so that'll get a high B tier. And I know, you think it's better than Volume 4? You even know your music? Hey, I'm just telling it like it is, man. You know, I think this album is better than Volume 4. I know. Oh boy. We're still in the early 1990s, and Tony Martin actually wound up leaving the band for a little while after their album Tear was released. And that means Ronnie James Dio comes back, and he records his third and final album with Black Sabbath, otherwise known as Dehumanizer. And to me, this is a step down from the previous two albums they recorded with Dio. Out of the three albums they recorded with him, this is the weakest one. But that being said, it definitely has a lot going for it. So it's got a darker tone to it than the previous albums they recorded with him. He's got a more aggressive vocal performance. The riffs sound more evil and sinister. So it's pretty darn good, not gonna lie. Computer God, After All, Buried Alive, those are probably some of my favorites on the album for sure. So even though I don't think it's quite as good as Mob Rules, definitely not as good as Heaven and Hell, I still think it gets a pretty solid high B tier spot. Where exactly though? I'd say it's probably better than Tear. I don't know if it's quite as good as Eternal Idol. I'm not too sold on this one. I'm gonna put it below the Eternal Idol, but only by a hair. So it still gets a pretty high B tier spot for me. And yes, it's also better than Volume 4. Come at me, brah. I forgot to mention too that Geezer Butler, the bassist, actually left the band for a while throughout the 1980s, but he made his return with Dehumanizer. You can definitely hear his playing in that album for sure. I really love his bass tones, and they always make a point to make his bass very audible in the mix, you know? It's not like with a lot of punk bands or thrash bands where the bass is just sort of buried. It just only props up the guitars. No, it's like he actually plays it like a lead instrument sometimes, which is pretty neat. And that definitely carries over to the next album that they recorded, which is Cross Purposes. And on this album, Tony Martin comes back, and, you know, he still has plenty of firepower in his voice. And it's a pretty good album, not gonna lie, it's pretty good. There's not a whole lot that stands out about it. You know, I think Dehumanizer is just a little bit better, but songs like Eyewitness, Evil Eye, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, those are some pretty good songs, and overall it's just a nice sounding album. So I'm gonna put it in B tier for sure. I actually do think Volume 4 might be just a little bit better than this one. So I am going to put it just below Volume 4. That's a win for the Volume 4 fans out there. And actually, you know what? I will bump up Volume 4 above tier. I think that's fair. It'll put it as a top 10 Black Sabbath album if I do that. So, hope that makes you happy. And oh boy, the next album. This is the final album with Tony Martin, otherwise known as Forbidden. And I wish it was forbidden to talk about this album, because this is Black Sabbath's worst album, for sure. It's got their worst songs on it as well. Shake Off the Chains, Can't Get Close Enough, The Illusion of Power especially.
Powerful, who are you fooling? You're caught in a complex catacomb of your own inadequacies and pitiful weaknesses. Your soul secretes insecurity, so you live on the reflection side of the mirror. You're terrified of true power, you fear.
Get a grip. This album sucks. Like, you could even hear it. Like, Geezer Butler basically left the band by this point. They replaced him with another bassist. He's not nearly as good, not nearly as interesting. I don't like his tones as much. Just gets kind of buried behind the guitars. And Tony's just totally phoning it in with this album. He doesn't even sound like he's trying. Tony Martin, more like phony farting. Am I right? But yeah, everybody just sounds very uninspired on this album. The songs just are not good. And the production kind of sucks, in spite of the fact this is their newest album out of these records. So, as a result, just the culmination of poor performances, uninspired songwriting, and it's just overall lazy. It's not even complacent, it's just straight up lazy. Really, Tony Iommi, he's the only person in the band putting in any kind of effort to make this good. And unfortunately, that's just not enough. So to me, this definitely gets D tier. It doesn't get F tier because it's not that dreadful, but it is bad. Now we fast forward to 2013. That's almost 20 years after Forbidden, by the way. No albums in between. Ozzy Osbourne, he marks his return with the band in almost 40 years. Geezer Butler's back at the band. Tony Iommi's still doing his thing. The only glaring omission is the lack of Bill Ward, which they replaced with Brad Wilk. And Brad Wilk, he's the drummer of Rage Against the Machine. He also played with Audioslave as well. And Audioslave was basically Rage Against the Machine with Chris Cornell from Soundgarden. So basically, not as good. I'm ready to hear it from the Soundgarden fans and the Audioslave fans in the comment section down below. But anyway, star-studded lineup. Most of the band is back in action, and we got ourselves 13. And this album's okay. It's decent. The End of the Beginning is basically a rehash of Black Sabbath, the song Black Sabbath, on the album Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath. Then Zeitgeist is basically a remake of Planet Caravan. And a lot of the other songs, they follow a pretty similar structure, which means that the album maybe lacks variety. And again, it just reminds me too much of a lot of their previous material, but maybe not quite as good. And Ozzy, you know, he's like in his 60s by this stage of the game, so he's not really able to hit a lot of those high notes that he could on Sabotage or Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, for example. But overall, you know, it's a decent listen, and I'm sure this made a lot of Black Sabbath fans happy to just have Ozzy back with the band, you know. And overall, it's a decent album. I would give it a low B tier. I would probably put it, I'm gonna say probably below Cross Purposes. Yeah. And I know that might be blasphemous too. I really liked, well, not really liked, but yeah, I thought Cross Purposes was pretty darn good. Fun fact for you too, if you actually count everything on the tier list, 13 is 13. That's somewhat intentional, but I guess everything just panned out accordingly, right? So, I don't know. So anyway, guys, that's my tier list for you. We'll do a quick recap. The worst album, hands down, is Forbidden. Just very bad album. And C tier, you got Born Again, Technical Ecstasy, Never Say Die. B tier, you've got Headless Cross, 7-star, 13, Cross Purposes, Tier, Volume 4, Dehumanizer, and The Eternal Idol. A tier, you've got Mob Rules, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Massive Reality, Black Sabbath, Sabotage. And then in S tier, you've got Heaven and Hell and Paranoid. To me, those are far and away the two best records that they've ever put out. And they're also very strong contenders for some of the best heavy metal albums of all time. From, of course, one of the best, greatest, and most iconic heavy metal bands of all time. So anyway, guys, it's going to be a wrap on today's video. If you enjoyed it, you found it entertaining, if you liked it, just give it a lick. Subscribe to the channel and ring that taco bell that we get notified the next time I upload. And let me know in the comment section down below on your favorite Black Sabbath albums or how you would rank this tier list. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok. And if you want to show super support for your boy, just hit up my link tree. Got Cash App and PayPal if you want to throw your boy some change. I also have free resources to help you and your family and friends go vegan. I also have resources for vegan activism. I've got resources for VST drum plugins for all the aspiring drummers and other musicians out there. I've also have a link for Reaper for anybody that needs a new DAW for music recording. And I don't know, you might find something else interesting over there. And as always, I love you guys, appreciate the continued support of my channel, and I'm glad you guys stuck around as that really makes my day. And to you I say,
Hasta la vista, baby!